The Andersons were, by all appearances, the kind of family everyone envied in their quiet suburban neighborhood. Their home stood nestled at the end of Meadow Lane, its pristine lawn bordered by a white picket fence Ruth had insisted on after they moved in years ago. Paul Anderson worked long, grueling night shifts at the local freight yard. It wasn't glamorous work, but it kept the bills paid and allowed Ruth to focus on running the household and raising their daughter, Emily. Paul loved his family fiercely. His life revolved around the two women he held dearest. When Emily was born, Paul made a quiet promise to himself that he would do everything in his power to provide her with stability. Every ache in his back, every blister on his hands from lifting crates, was a price he paid willingly. Still, even the most dutiful husband and father could miss the subtle shifts within his own home. Ruth had been growing more distant for months. At first, Paul attributed her quiet moments and sudden retreats to stress or fatigue. Everyone carried their private burdens, and Ruth had always been the type to bear hers silently. But lately, her silences felt less like introspection and more like evasion. There was an emptiness in her eyes when she looked at him, a far cry from the warmth they used to share. Paul might have continued to write it off if not for the day he came home early. It was an unseasonably cool autumn afternoon, the kind where the wind whipped leaves across the driveway in fiery bursts of red and gold. His shift had been cut short due to equipment repairs, a rare stroke of fortune. As he approached the house, the muffled sound of Emily's laughter spilled through the open window. Smiling, Paul slowed his step, savoring the moment. He stopped just short of the door to catch the conversation inside. "She thinks she's so slick," Emily said, her words barely audible over her giggles. "Your mom?" a second voice asked. Nicole, Emily's closest friend, her tone a mixture of curiosity and amusement. "Yeah, it's hilarious," Emily replied. "Dad is so stupid he doesn't even realize that every night he's at work, Mom's boyfriend comes over." Paul froze. His heart hammered in his chest, disbelief tangling with a surge of anger and hurt. He strained to hear more. "No way," Nicole said, her voice hushed now. "Are you serious?" "Dead serious," Emily replied with a chuckle. "He even uses the back door. They think I'm asleep, but I see everything." Paul's vision blurred, his knuckles whitening as he gripped the doorknob. He stepped inside. The creak of the front door silenced the girl's laughter instantly. Nicole's eyes widened, and Emily turned, her face pale as her father appeared in the hallway. "What are you talking about?" Paul asked, his voice calm, almost too calm. He stared at Emily, the weight of her words bearing down on him like a freight train. "Nothing, Dad," Emily stammered, the color rushing back to her cheeks in a flush of embarrassment. "We were just joking around." Paul's gaze shifted to Nicole, who avoided his eyes. "Nicole?" Nicole squirmed under his scrutiny. We were just, talking about random stuff. It wasn't serious." Paul said nothing for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Finally, he nodded. "Nicole, why don't you head home? Emily and I need to have a little chat." The girl grabbed her backpack and fled the house without a word. Emily shifted uneasily, avoiding her father's gaze. "Is it true?" Paul's voice was low, steady. "Emily, answer me. Is it true?" "I was just joking," she mumbled, staring at her feet. "You know how Nicole and I joke around." Paul inhaled deeply, trying to rein in the storm of emotions threatening to overtake him. He knelt, bringing himself eye level with Emily. "I need you to be honest with me, sweetheart. What you just said, it's not the kind of joke I'd expect from you." Emily hesitated. Her eyes darted to the side, searching for an escape, but Paul's steady gaze left her nowhere to hide. "I don't know, okay," she finally blurted. "I've seen someone come over a couple of times. He comes late, after you leave for work. But I don't know for sure if they're doing anything." Paul stood slowly, the weight of her words anchoring him in place. His mind raced, trying to make sense of what he'd just heard. Could it be a misunderstanding? A friend? A neighbor? Ruth had always been social, but she'd never given him any reason to doubt her fidelity. Yet, the pieces that had nagged at the back of his mind, the late nights, the hushed phone calls, now seemed to fall into place. The rest of the day passed in a blur. Ruth came home, her smile as bright as ever, her demeanor unchanged. If she sensed Paul's unease, she didn't show it. He pretended everything was normal, but a growing coldness took root in his chest. That night, Paul left for his shift as usual, but instead of driving to work, he parked his truck 2 streets over and killed the engine. From there, he had a clear view of his home. Hours passed as he sat in the darkness, every minute that ticked by tightening the knot of anxiety in his stomach. The quiet street seemed to mock him, its stillness amplifying the cacophony of thoughts racing through his mind. Then, shortly after midnight, movement caught his eye. A shadow slipped through the side gate and made its way toward the back door of his house. Paul's breath caught. He clenched the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles turned white. There it was, the confirmation he never wanted. Paul's heart pounded as he forced himself to stay calm. He stepped out of the truck, his boots crunching softly on the gravel as he made his way toward the house. The cold night air stung his cheeks, but the fury boiling inside him kept him warm. The time for doubts and second-guessing had passed. He was about to uncover the truth, no matter how much it hurt. Paul moved through the shadows, his steps deliberate and silent. The world around him felt muffled, as though the crisp night air conspired to cloak his every move. Each footfall brought him closer to the house, closer to the truth he'd hoped he would never have to face. The backyard gate stood slightly ajar, swaying gently in the breeze. He stepped through it, his senses on high alert. The faint murmur of voices filtered through the back door, a low, intimate tone that didn't belong to casual conversation. His heart clenched as he crept to the window, positioning himself just out of sight. Inside, Ruth stood in the kitchen, her laughter soft but unmistakable. She wasn't alone. Opposite her, leaning against the counter with a casual familiarity that stung more than any insult, was a man Paul didn't recognize. Tall, broad-shouldered, with the kind of easy confidence that came naturally to someone who'd never worried about being caught. Paul's breath came shallow and quick, fogging the glass. He felt his pulse hammering in his ears as the man reached out, tucking a stray strand of Ruth's hair behind her ear. She tilted her head toward him, her eyes alight with an affection Paul hadn't seen in years. The weight of betrayal settled in Paul's chest, heavy and cold. He thought of Emily, of the home he'd worked tirelessly to provide, and of the countless nights he'd spent hauling freight, believing it was all for them. And here she was, laughing, touching, with a stranger who had invaded what was supposed to be sacred. Paul stepped back from the window, his mind racing. Confrontation was inevitable, but it couldn't be impulsive. He needed control, over himself and over the situation. He pulled out his phone, snapping a series of photos through the window. Evidence. Proof of what he already knew but didn't want to believe. The sound of laughter spurred him into action. He moved to the back door, his fingers tightening on the handle. For a moment, he hesitated, the weight of the moment pressing down on him. Once he opened that door, there would be no going back. With a deep breath, he turned the knob and stepped inside. The laughter died instantly. Ruth's head snapped toward him, her face draining of color as their eyes met. The man froze, his confident posture stiffening under Paul's gaze. Paul closed the door behind him with a quiet, deliberate click. Paul. Ruth's voice was barely a whisper, her hands trembling as she took an involuntary step back. Don't stop on my account, Paul said, his voice calm but carrying an edge that cut through the tension like a blade. I wouldn't want to interrupt whatever this is. The man straightened, his eyes flicking between Ruth and Paul. Look, I think I should go. You're not going anywhere, Paul said sharply, his tone leaving no room for argument. He took a step forward, his broad frame casting a shadow that seemed to fill the room. Not until I get some answers. Paul, please, Ruth began, but he cut her off with a glare that made her words falter. Who is he? Paul demanded, his eyes never leaving Ruth's. She opened her mouth, then closed it again, her silence more damning than any confession. The man shifted uncomfortably, his earlier bravado crumbling under Paul's unyielding scrutiny. I'm Andrew, he said finally, his voice unsteady. Look, I didn't mean for this to happen. Paul turned his gaze to Andrew, his expression unreadable. Didn't mean for what to happen, he asked, his voice low, measured. You didn't mean to sneak into another man's home? Didn't mean to touch his wife? Or are you just sorry you got caught? Andrew took a step back, raising his hands in a feeble attempt at placation. I didn't know. You didn't know she was married? Paul barked, his voice rising. That's a hell of a thing to miss. Ruth stepped between them, her voice trembling. Paul, please, stop. It's not what you think. Paul's laughter was bitter and humorless. Not what I think. Then by all means, enlighten me, Ruth. Tell me what this is. She looked away, tears welling in her eyes. It just happened. I didn't plan it. Didn't plan it, Paul repeated, his voice dripping with sarcasm. That makes it better, does it? You betrayed me, Ruth. Betrayed everything we built, everything I thought we had. Andrew edged toward the door, but Paul's sharp glare stopped him in his tracks. Sit down, Paul growled. We're not finished. Paul, Ruth started again, but he held up a hand. Do you have any idea what you've done? His voice cracked, the fury giving way to something deeper, something raw and painful. To me? To Emily? What am I supposed to tell her, Ruth? That her mother couldn't even wait until I left for work to bring a stranger into our home? Ruth's tears spilled over, but Paul didn't soften. The betrayal burned too brightly, its edges too sharp. I'm sorry, she whispered, the words sounding hollow. Sorry. Paul's voice was incredulous. You're sorry you got caught. That's not the same thing. Andrew shifted again, and Paul finally turned his full attention to him. You. How long? Andrew hesitated, his gaze darting to Ruth. She nodded almost imperceptibly, giving him permission to speak. A few months, he admitted, his voice barely audible. A few months, Paul repeated. He shook his head, his fists clenching and unclenching at his sides. You've been stealing my life for a few months, and you think that makes it okay? Paul's voice dropped, cold and deadly. You're going to leave now. And if I ever see you near my house, near my wife, near my daughter again, he didn't finish the sentence, but the threat hung heavy in the air. Andrew nodded quickly, grabbing his coat and bolting out the door without looking back. Ruth crumpled into a chair, her sobs echoing in the silence that followed. Paul stood motionless, his chest heaving as he fought to regain control. This isn't over, he said finally, his voice flat. Not by a long shot. And with that, he turned and walked out, leaving Ruth alone with her guilt and the shattered pieces of their life. The night stretched on as Paul sat alone in the truck parked 2 streets away from his home, the weight of the confrontation pressing down on him like a boulder. His hands gripped the steering wheel, knuckles white, as he replayed Ruth's tear-streaked face and Andrew's pitiful attempt at an apology. Anger churned in his chest, hot and unrelenting, but beneath it all, there was something worse, an ache, a hollow space where trust and love had once lived. He had spent years building a life with Ruth. Every overtime shift, every backbreaking hour hauling freight, every unspoken sacrifice, all of it had been for her and Emily. And now, it seemed, it had all been for nothing. The truck's engine roared to life, the sound startling in the quiet street. Paul drove the short distance home, his mind made up. There was no saving this. The damage was too deep, the betrayal too vast. He pulled into the driveway, stepping out into the cold night air, and approached the house he had once thought of as his sanctuary. Inside, Ruth was still sitting in the kitchen, her face pale and streaked with tears. She flinched as the door slammed shut behind him, the sound reverberating through the house like a judge's gavel. Paul didn't say anything at first, letting the silence stretch between them. He leaned against the counter, arms crossed, his gaze sharp and unyielding. Ruth fidgeted in her chair, her hands twisting the edge of her sweater. Paul, she began, her voice hoarse. Stop. His tone was curt, cutting through her words like a knife. I don't want to hear excuses. I don't want to hear apologies. I've heard enough. Ruth's lip trembled, but she didn't argue. She seemed to sense there was no point. I trusted you, Ruth, Paul continued, his voice low but steady, each word weighted with pain. I gave you everything I had. I worked nights, weekends, whatever it took to make sure this family was taken care of. And this is how you repay me. I didn't mean for it to happen, she whispered, her hands trembling. It was a mistake. A mistake. Paul's voice rose, his anger breaking through. A mistake is forgetting to take the trash out. A mistake is leaving the stove on. You don't accidentally let a man into our home, into my home, while I'm out breaking my back to keep food on the table. Ruth flinched at the venom in his words, her tears falling freely now. Please, Paul. We can work through this. For Emily's sake. Paul's laugh was cold and humorless. For Emily's sake. Do you think I don't know what this will do to her? She's the one who told me, Ruth. She's the one who overheard you. Do you have any idea how that makes me feel? My own daughter knew what was going on before I did. Ruth's face crumpled at this, and she buried her head in her hands. But Paul wasn't done. You brought a stranger into our lives. Into our home. You disrespected me, our marriage and our family. And you did it knowing full well that I was out there every night, working myself to the bone for you. He pushed away from the counter, his movements deliberate as he paced the room. I don't want to hear your excuses, Ruth. There's nothing you can say that will fix this. It's over. Ruth's head shot up, her eyes wide and pleading. Paul, no. Please. Don't say that. We can go to counseling. We can fix this. No, we can't, Paul said firmly. This isn't something you come back from. You destroyed the foundation of our marriage. I can't look at you without seeing him. Without seeing the lies. She stood, desperation in her voice as she moved toward him. Don't do this, Paul. Don't throw away everything we've built. I'm not the one who threw it away, he shot back, his voice icy. That was you. He stepped back, creating a physical distance between them that mirrored the chasm in their relationship. I want you out of this house, Ruth. Tonight. Her face went slack with shock. Paul, where am I supposed to go? That's not my problem, he said coldly. You should have thought about that before you let him into our lives. She stared at him, her face a mixture of disbelief and heartbreak. You don't mean this. Yes, I do, he said, his voice unwavering. Pack your things and go. I don't care where you go or who you call. But you're not staying here. Paul, she sobbed, reaching for him, but he stepped back again, his expression hard. You can stay long enough to pack your bags, he said. After that, I don't want to see you in this house again. She sank back into the chair, her sobs filling the room. Paul didn't waver. He turned and walked out of the kitchen, heading for the living room. His hands shook as he gripped the edge of the mantel, staring at the family photos that adorned it. Each one felt like a mockery now, a reminder of a life he'd thought was solid and real but had been built on lies. In the distance, he could hear Ruth moving through the house, the sound of drawers opening and closing as she packed. He didn't look back. His decision was made. There was no room for second chances, not after this. When Ruth finally left, her footsteps hesitant as she carried her suitcase to the door, Paul didn't say a word. He stood in the living room, staring at the photos, listening to the sound of the door closing behind her. The silence that followed was deafening. Paul sat down heavily on the couch, his head in his hands. For the first time that night, he allowed himself to feel the full weight of what had happened. The betrayal, the anger, the heartbreak, it all came crashing down on him at once. But beneath the pain, there was something else, clarity. He would rebuild. For Emily, for himself. The pieces of his life might have been shattered, but Paul was determined to put them back together, one step at a time. The hours after Ruth's departure dragged like slow-moving freight cars, each second punctuated by an oppressive silence that seemed to fill every corner of the house. Paul sat in the living room, the faint hum of the refrigerator the only sound in the otherwise still air. The space around him felt unfamiliar, alien, as though the betrayal had seeped into the very walls. He glanced at the family photos still displayed on the mantel. They had once brought him pride, a testament to the life he'd built. Now, they felt like relics of a lie. Paul rose and gathered them one by one, his hands steady but his heart heavy. He placed them into a box, sealing away the memories he couldn't yet bear to confront. The soft creak of the stairs broke his reverie. Emily stood at the top, her hair tousled from sleep, her small frame wrapped in her favorite blanket. Her eyes, still puffy from the tears she'd shed earlier, met his. Is Mom gone? She asked, her voice trembling. Paul nodded, motioning for her to come down. She descended hesitantly, her blanket trailing behind her like a shield. Paul sank onto the couch, and she curled up beside him, leaning her head against his shoulder. Is it my fault? She whispered after a long silence. Paul's heart twisted. He wrapped an arm around her, holding her close. No, sweetheart. None of this is your fault. Don't ever think that. But I told you, she said, her voice cracking. If I hadn't said anything. Stop, Paul interrupted gently but firmly. You did the right thing, Emily. I'm proud of you for being honest with me. This is not on you. It's on your mom, and me, for not seeing it sooner. They sat like that for a while, father and daughter, the unspoken weight of their new reality pressing down on them. Paul stroked Emily's hair, his mind racing with thoughts of how to move forward. For her sake, he couldn't afford to crumble. She needed him now more than ever. The next morning, Paul woke early, his body stiff from a restless night on the couch. Emily was still asleep in the upstairs bedroom. He made himself a cup of coffee, staring out the kitchen window at the backyard, where traces of last night's confrontation lingered like shadows. His phone buzzed on the counter, pulling him from his thoughts. It was a message from his lawyer, Carla, who had agreed to meet him that afternoon to discuss filing for divorce. Paul had called her the night before, laying out the situation in clipped, factual tones. Carla's response had been measured but empathetic. "We'll take care of it, Paul," she'd said. "This won't be easy, but you're doing the right thing." Paul glanced at the clock. He had a few hours before the meeting, and he couldn't bear to sit in the house any longer. He needed to clear his head. Grabbing his jacket, he left a note for Emily and headed out. The drive to the trailhead was short but gave Paul just enough time to reflect on the events of the past 24 hours. The crisp morning air greeted him as he stepped out of the truck, the scent of pine and damp earth filling his lungs. Hiking had always been his way of finding clarity, a rare escape from the grind of work and the chaos of life. Today, the solitude felt more necessary than ever. The trail was quiet, the only sounds the rustle of leaves and the crunch of gravel beneath his boots. As he climbed higher, the weight on his chest began to lift, replaced by a sharp focus. His mind turned to the logistics of what lay ahead, dividing assets, custody arrangements for Emily, untangling years of shared life. The emotional toll would be steep, but Paul knew the practicalities would be just as grueling. He paused at a clearing, the valley stretching out below him in shades of green and gold. For the first time in what felt like days, he allowed himself to exhale fully. There was no going back. His marriage was over, but his life wasn't. He would rebuild, stronger, wiser, and on his own terms. That afternoon, Paul sat across from Carla in her tidy, sunlit office. The lawyer's desk was immaculate, save for a stack of legal forms she'd prepared in advance. "I've seen worse," Carla said after Paul finished recounting the details of Ruth's infidelity. "But that doesn't mean it's easy. The first step is getting your paperwork in order. Have you thought about what you want in terms of custody?" Paul nodded. "Emily stays with me. She's my priority." Carla gave him a measured look. "That's going to depend on what Ruth wants. Most courts lean toward shared custody unless there's clear evidence it's not in the child's best interest." Paul's jaw tightened. "She brought a stranger into my home, into Emily's life. If that's not a reason to fight for full custody, I don't know what is." "We'll make that case," Carla said, her tone steady. "But you'll need to document everything, dates, times, any evidence you have. It's going to be a battle." Paul nodded, the resolve in his chest hardening. "Whatever it takes." When Paul returned home that evening, Emily greeted him at the door, her eyes full of questions she didn't know how to ask. He smiled softly, kneeling to meet her gaze. "It's going to be okay," he said, his voice steady. "We're going to be okay." Emily nodded, her small hand slipping into his. Paul squeezed it gently, a silent promise that he would hold them both together, no matter what storms lay ahead. The weeks that followed Ruth's departure were a whirlwind of legal battles, tense conversations, and painful revelations. Paul juggled his responsibilities as a father, his job at the freight yard, and the emotional weight of dismantling a marriage he had once believed would last forever. Every step was a reminder of what had been lost, and what still needed protecting. Emily adjusted as best as any teenager could. She put on a brave face at school, excelling in her classes and pretending not to notice the whispers of her peers who had overheard fragments of the scandal. At home, she sought comfort in her father's unwavering presence. They cooked dinner together, watched old movies, and talked about her plans for college. For Paul, these moments were a lifeline, a reminder of why he was fighting so hard to rebuild their lives. Ruth, on the other hand, had been anything but cooperative. Paul's demand for full custody ignited a firestorm of accusations and counterarguments. She insisted that Emily needed her mother, that her mistake didn't define her ability to parent. But Paul's lawyer, Carla, was relentless. With Paul's collected evidence, photos, witness accounts, and documentation of Ruth's infidelity, she built a case that left little room for Ruth's protests. The day of the final custody hearing was overcast, the sky mirroring Paul's mood as he sat in the courthouse waiting room with Emily by his side. Ruth was there, too, her face pale and drawn. She avoided Paul's gaze, her hands clutching the strap of her purse so tightly her knuckles were white. When the judge delivered the ruling, Paul's heart raced. Full custody was awarded to him, with Ruth granted visitation under strict conditions. The judge cited the destabilizing impact of Ruth's actions on the family as a significant factor in the decision. Ruth burst into tears, her sobs echoing in the courtroom. Paul felt no triumph, only a hollow sense of resolution. The battle was over, but the scars it left behind would linger for years. That evening, Paul and Emily returned to their quiet home. The weight of the day hung heavy, but there was a sense of finality that hadn't been there before. The house, though still filled with memories of Ruth, felt more like theirs now. A fresh start. They shared a quiet dinner, the clinking of silverware filling the space where words failed. Afterward, Emily retreated to her room, leaving Paul alone in the living room. He stared at the box of photos he had packed away weeks ago, debating whether to open it. Finally, he lifted the lid. One by one, he sifted through the snapshots of vacations, birthdays, and anniversaries. Each image was a reminder of what he had fought for and what he had lost. His fingers lingered on a photo of Ruth holding a newborn Emily, her face radiant with joy. For a moment, Paul allowed himself to feel the pain of it all, the betrayal, the love that had once been real, the family that could never be the same. But then he set the photo aside, replacing the lid on the box. It wasn't about Ruth anymore. It was about Emily and the future they would build together. Months passed, and life found a new rhythm. Paul threw himself into his work, finding solace in the physicality of his job. Emily flourished, her laughter returning as she grew more comfortable in their new reality. They took up hiking on the weekends, exploring trails Paul had once traversed alone. They talked about everything and nothing, the bond between them strengthening with every step forward. Ruth's visits were sporadic at best. The woman who had once been the center of Paul's world now felt like a distant memory. He allowed her space in Emily's life, but their interactions remained cool and distant. He wasn't angry anymore, anger required energy he couldn't spare. Instead, he felt a quiet resolve to leave the past where it belonged. One crisp autumn afternoon, Paul stood in the backyard, the leaves crunching beneath his boots as he worked to clear the garden. Emily's laughter drifted from the porch, where she sat with her friends, their voices bright against the backdrop of the season's chill. Paul paused, leaning on his rake, and looked at the house, their home. It had been a place of pain, but it had also become a place of healing. He saw the future now, clear and bright. He didn't need Ruth to complete his life. He had Emily, and he had himself. That was enough. As the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of orange and gold, Paul allowed himself a rare smile. The storm had passed. The house was his again, and so was his peace. And this time, he wouldn't let anyone take it away.